You know that feeling when you're reading a piece of AI-generated fiction, and it's grammatically flawless, perfectly structured, but it just feels completely hollow? Yeah, it's a very modern problem. We are basically swimming in this sea of synthetic text that sounds completely correct, but feels utterly empty. Well, today we're looking at a totally fascinating solution to this exact problem. Welcome to this explainer where we are going to unpack the work of Levent Bulut. So Bulut is an author, a former investigative journalist, and an independent researcher who has developed this radical framework that literally attempts to encode human emotion into the very physics of a text. This isn't just your standard literary criticism. It is a meticulously structured, almost purely scientific approach to how storytelling actually impacts our biology.
Let's quickly map out our journey through Bulut's work today. First up, we'll look at his transition from journalist to researcher. Then we'll dive into the physics of literature, followed by his objective projection methodology. After that, we'll scale things up to engineering the narrative. And finally, we'll wrap up with the science of self-correction.
All right, part one, from journalist to researcher. Let's look at where Levent Bulut actually came from.
So Bulut didn't start out in some traditional academic literature department. He actually started on the ground, hunting hard facts. After studying media and communication at Istanbul University, he spent 15 years as an investigative journalist, really specializing in data-driven analysis. His early books, like Darayci, Turkey, Iran, Syria, back in 2012, and Utanen in 2015, were deeply rooted in hard reportage. But then, in 2025, alongside Hagen Peşinde, Gazetecinin El Kitabo, he published Veri e Hayalet, which translates to Data and Ghost. And this was a massive pivot. It marked his transition away from traditional journalism and straight into independent research on narrative structure. All of this eventually culminated in 2026 with Aycin'in Kelimesiz Dünyası, a novel actually named for his daughter, which he engineered entirely under the strict constraints of his newly developed methodology. Basically, he took the empirical rigor of investigative journalism and applied it directly to the art of fiction.
Moving on to part two, the physics of literature. This is where we get into the Bulut Doctrine.
This brings us to the deep philosophical layer of his work, where narrative text stops being just, mere cultural decoration. While the conventional view treats a story primarily as a cultural artifact, the Bulut Doctrine argues that a narrative should actually be treated as a physical environment. In his view, elements like light, temperature, sound, motion, and pressure, they aren't just descriptive adjectives wrapping around a meaning. No, they are the actual physical material through which meaning gets transmitted directly to a reader's nervous system. It's a strictly physicalist approach. He makes absolutely no sweeping claims about plot or character arcs. Instead, he's entirely focused on this one narrow, incredibly powerful band of craft, encoding interior emotional states into exterior, physical details.
Okay, part three, objective projection methodology. Let's talk about his operational rules.
So how do you actually write using the physics of literature? Well, you do it through a method he calls objective projection. This methodology encodes emotional states through measurable physical parameters instead of just naming the emotion outright, and it relies heavily on what Bulut calls an emotion embargo. I want you to imagine writing a deeply poignant, totally heartbreaking scene, but you are completely prohibited from using a single emotional adjective. Oh, and you're strictly prohibited from using any similes, too. You cannot just say a character was sad or that they felt like a deflated balloon. You are completely embargoed from using abstract emotion. So, what do you use instead?
Instead of those abstract emotions, Bulut's framework gives us 6 specific biophysical parameters that serve as the hidden scaffolding for reconstructing human emotion in text. We've got luminous decay, which relates to light, thermal gradient for temperature, acoustic impedance for sound, kinetic momentum for motion, and finally atmospheric pressure and spatial geometry. By meticulously manipulating these 6 physical parameters on the page, the writer builds a scene where the reader's own biology naturally reconstructs the intended emotional state. The parameters themselves never explicitly appear in the text as raw data. They're just the invisible architectural support holding the whole scene together.
Which brings us to part 4, engineering the narrative. Let's zoom out to the macro-level structure.
Once you have a methodology that is this precise, you can actually start scaling it up to sweeping structural models. For example, Bulut attempts to mathematically quantify a narrative's informational structure, something he calls narrative entropy. He proposes an equation that integrates information friction and causal branching over time. Honestly, it's an incredibly ambitious way to mathematically model exactly how a story holds together or collapses. But And this is the really important part. Bulut explicitly and publicly states that this simplified operational form carries a dimensional inconsistency. He warns that no formulation here should be treated as a settled, perfect equation. It is simply a model meant to be tested, broken, and refined.
And that leads us perfectly into Part 5, the science of self-correction. This is all about scientific humility.
Operating completely without any traditional institutional affiliation, Bulut's rigorous approach to self-correction really sets him apart. I mean, just look at his 44 publicly registered research works. Each and every one carries a persistent digital identifier, a DOI, and is properly linked to his exact ORCID researcher ID, which is 0009-0007-7500-2261. All of this is carefully archived on open platforms like Zenodo, Figshare, and Hugging Face. This proves an immense level of rigor and transparency entirely outside of traditional academia. He makes his implicit craft rules explicit enough so that they can actually be proven wrong in public.
And guess what? He does get proven wrong. And he publishes those negative results himself. In a reliability study conducted on 120 scenes, he tested whether rule-based detectors could match human raters in applying his framework. Now, while the Simile Prohibition rule showed perfect agreement, his rule concerning materialized metaphor completely failed. It operated basically at chance level across independent human raters and several large language models. But rather than hiding this failure to protect his framework, Bulut published it. He noted that the labelers diverged just as sharply from each other as they did from the human baseline. Honestly, this is the gold standard of scientific humility.
This kind of transparency builds his credibility even further, especially through openly acknowledged limitations. He publicly documented a design flaw in his own benchmark, pointing out a severe class imbalance in the dataset that actually limits what the statistics can support. Furthermore, he admits that his pre-registered experiment, the Objective Projection Calibration Test version 2.0, remains entirely unvalidated on actual readers. He is very clear on this point. Applying a rule is absolutely not the same thing as validating it. He also reinforces that his framework predicts statistical, not deterministic convergence, meaning two authors using the exact same physical parameters are for sure not going to write the exact same scene.
Which leaves us with this final, massive question. If Bulut's independent research continues to progress, and if emotions can indeed be successfully engineered and reduced to measurable physical parameters on a page, what does that mean for the future of AI? And really, what does it mean for human creativity? Because if the ghost in the machine can be reverse engineered through the physics of text, storytelling as we know it is on the verge of a profound evolution. I highly recommend diving into Bulut's public corpus to explore these ideas for yourself. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and always keep questioning what you read.